Yes, Guyana to the world.
Globuspan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globuspan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building.
She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country.
Globuspan believes every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diaspora and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana. As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adapt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globuspan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
With many flavors, 6 different people blended together. Raise your flag high in unity, we're family with one destiny. Raise your flag high in unity.
Welcome to another edition of Globuspan 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Nuhar Singh. Joining us as usual is our technical operator, Mr. Devin Bissoon. Tonight we're discussing not shades of autocracy in Guyana, but shades of rigging, if we may use that term. We're discussing electoral rigging and what steps can be taken in order to prevent election rigging in Guyana. And joining us for this discussion tonight is two very, very prominent. One is a professor, another one is a practicing lawyer in Guyana, a senior counsel, and a member of ANUG, a new United Guyana political party. Mr. Schumann is supposed to join us tonight. Regrettably, he just phoned a few minutes ago indicating that an emergency came up and he cannot join us tonight. So we'll have these two esteemed gentlemen to give us this discourse and analyze this concept of election rigging and how we can go forward to prevent or at least to stop election rigging in Guyana. Professor Paul Tennessee, no stranger to this program, and I don't know if I should still call him an activist, but certainly he was a political activist for a couple of decades in Guyana. He was the leader of political party, the Democratic Labor Movement, DLM. And I already introduced Mr. Timothy Jonas, senior counsel. So Paul, since you are with a lot of political experience, you experienced both democratic elections in Guyana and electoral fraud in Guyana, going back, I think it's from the 50s to 1992. Do you want to give us a little background? Why are we discussing this subject? Why is it important for us to talk about election rigging and how to prevent election rigging?
Well, thank you for having me on the program. And well, basically, we have to begin by saying that we were a British colony until 1966. Today, I'm teaching a course on comparative criminal justice system. So I'm looking at all various countries, Britain, France, Japan, you know, how the criminal justice system emerged. And you can't do that without studying the legal system, the evolution of the legal system, and the rule of law and all that. So I was looking at England for this program particularly because, you know, since the 10th century, the English have been trying to evolve towards a kind of democratic system. And so in Guyana from 1600 to 1953, we never had something called free and fair elections, which became popular in Guyana. In 1953, we had free and fair elections under a new constitutional reform that allowed a kind of internal self-government. The governor was still in charge, but they had a premier, and the locals were able to participate. That's how Jagan got his seat. Yeah, and Bonham and Jainarayan Singh and Ashton Chase and all these people became members of parliament. But within 153 days, the British invaded with soldiers and overthrew the government, the internal self-government, under the allegation that they, it was they were communist leaders, and that the British intelligence had information that the Jagans were connected with the Communist Party of Britain. And in those days, the Cold War began in 1948, communism versus anti-communism. But then again, they went backwards, and the government was responsible until 57. We had elections again. It was free and fair in 57, and the PPP won. And then there were two PPP, the Jaganites PPP and the Bonhamites PPP. I recall 53 very well because the British occupied our store under Dr. Lachman Singh in James Street, All Boys Town. And my father was in the political struggle then with people like UC Guyana and them. So anyhow, the next election, I think, was 61 and 60. Every 3-4 years, there were elections. And those were free and fair up to 64. Well, I was Secretary of Justice Party Youth Movement. And so I was part of the campaign in the 1964 elections. And the election was transparent. It was free and fair, even though the party I supported did not win a seat, but it was free and fair. And then we got to 68. In 1968, the UF-PNC coalition disintegrated by then, when the next election was due. And the PNC always had the thesis, and they managed that well. They said, look, if we have a free and fair election in Guyana, the Indo-Guyanese are the majority, and therefore Afro-Guyanese as a minority will never have political power. So we have to steal the elections. We have to find a way of doing it, you know? So because of that, they carried out a lot of electoral reforms, allowed Guyanese abroad to vote, they allowed proxy voting. There were a lot of problems with the list, was padded and so forth. So this is well documented. And then we went to the 73 election, and the same thing happened again. As a matter of fact, one Granada television did the making of a prime minister. By 73, Bonham did it again, and so forth. They documented the fraud. It was very evident. So then we go all the way to 1985. Bonham died in August 85, and Hoyt became president. Now, Hoyt was very involved in the rigging of the referendum and the elections before 85. But
The three elections, yes.
yeah, the worst fraudulent election we had was in 1985, and it was the last one. But there were attempts by Mr. Hoyt to rig the 1990 elections. As a matter of fact, virtually what happened was that we were to have elections in 78, but instead of doing that, they had a referendum. They changed the constitution, and Bonham became like a monarchy in the 9th century of England. The very centralized power, executive president. He got a lot of powers, and then party paramountcy became a new concept. That is, the party is above the state, the party is above everything. So you were accountable to the party, not accountable, like they flew the flag of the courts, the PNC flag and the national flag, that kind of thing. So Hoyt tried to rig the election in 1990, but by then the opposition parties united under the Patriotic Coalition for Democracy, and there were a lot of campaigns, a lot of protests, and President Carter came and he negotiated with us, and then Hoyt was able to get an extension again from 90 to 92. Another extension, just like before. Anyhow, for whatever reason, whether it was pressure from the United States or whether Mr. Hoyt had some epiphany, but he allowed uh, a virtually a free and fair election on 92. I said virtually because we'll come back to that on how we can develop a comprehensive policy to ensure this free and fair. I never said anything about the 92 elections, but I lived in South Annandale and I went to vote in North Annandale, and the polling agent there was showing me how to vote, which party to vote for. So I'll get back to that when we talk about a comprehensive policy. And many of our candidates live in Bel Air, live in this place, that place. We got no votes there. But I didn't say anything because 92 was a big moment for us. It was a moment since 1968. And we all wanted free and fair election. My personal overall objective was free and fair election. And I convinced our movement that that should be our priority. We focus more on that than getting into political office. And lo and behold, it happened. So what we'd like to see, or personally what I would like to see, is that democracy based on free, verifiable, free and fair elections is institutionalized in Guyana. And I was very disappointed that in 2020, we had a big hocus pocus about whether the election was free and fair, in spite of the fact that people like Jonas and others and international observers had sort of verified the election as free and fair. So I wrote a document called A Case for Free and Fair Elections that documented, I think I'm going to publish it now as a book, documented all the frauds from in Guyana up to 85. And I got published another paper on the 2020 elections. I went into very detail about what happened in 2020, put all the perspectives, trying to make sense of what happened here. So I would say that the reason why we are concerned about free and fair elections ultimately is because in the evolution of Guyana, there was one word that has a consistent theme in our history: freedom, whether it was conquest, slavery, indentureship, 20th century colonialism, or people wanted freedom. And there are no kings and queens in Guyana. We come from the same origin, whether it's conquest, slavery, indentureship, that's where we came from. So nobody has a right to decide that they are now the king or queen of Guyana and that we have to obey them. They are not our bosses. The people of Guyana are supposed to be the boss. We are supposed to elect and recall our leadership in a verifiable, free and fair election. So, and I believe more than that, democracy cannot function without a procedure that allows that and be the basis for the development of a country. I think dictatorships and autocracies don't contribute significantly to development.
Okay, well, I think that's a nice comprehensive background about the electoral fraud. So Jonas, would you like to add to that? Hello?
That was very thorough.
Yeah.
I agree with most of it. I think that my friend Dr. Tennessee was less charitable to President Hoyt than he could have been. Burnham died in 85, and just months later, the 85 elections came about. At the time, there was a serious tug of war for succession to Burnham among the senior ministers in the PNC at the time, particularly, as I remember, Hamilton Green and Desmond Hoyt.
Mm-hmm.
Desmond Hoyt assumed the presidency.
Right.
But I believe that the machinery which had been in existence for so many election cycles was just started up again.
Mhm.
So that it was the very next election that President Hoyt agreed with the Carter Center that it should be run under the scrutiny of the Carter Center using a new procedure where both sides had agreed to the chairman of the Elections Commission, the very courageous Collins, and the elections were held.
Right.
So, given our culture and our history and our poor institutions, there is no doubt that at the lower and middle level of management on both sides, there were attempts in 92 and subsequently and before to change the election result. You hear stories about ballot stuffing in individual places of poll. There are places in Guyana where, although the procedure is that both large parties are entitled to be represented, the reality back in those days is that one side couldn't go. It was physically dangerous. So you had easy occasions of ballot stuffing on both sides. But by and large, I believe the 92 result was fair, as my friend Dr. Tennessee is saying, and the correct result was achieved. Because the difference on that occasion was stark. It wasn't a narrow margin. So the right party won. And I think by and large, since then, with the exception of a slight blip on the Gokul, which we should not forget, and a much larger blip in 2020, we have had the right result, at least at the end of the day. But the processes that we have gone through reflect, to my mind, that there is a serious dearth of ethics, of integrity among our leadership. At the end of the day, democracy is the best thing that we have, and democracy needs to be upheld whether you win or lose, because sovereignty belongs to the people. It doesn't belong to anybody else. And we are all here for a short span of years. None of us has blue blood, as Paul points out. We all have red blood. We're all the same. And none of us is more entitled to the other. None of us is more Guyanese than the other. I am Guyanese for 51 years.
You're
I
not young.
don't try to buy more Guyanese than you because my people came before yours. I don't concede to anybody else that they're more Guyanese than me because they were here before me. I am Guyanese. I love this place. And to me, the institution that we have, which protects us and protects our freedoms and protects our rights, is democracy. So whether I support you or not, I support the democratic system, and I will support the result that that democratic system produces.
Well, I think we have two very comprehensive analysis, discussion, history of election fraud in Guyana. And now that puts us in a position to talk about a policy framework to prevent fraud in the future. And Paul, you want to lead the discussion on that?
Well, not to lead, but I'd like to share some.
Hear that.
Um, I think we have to reach a point in the evolution of Guyana where we don't have at each election a lot of conflicts about the ultimate results. There are many countries in the world are having difficulty with the same problem. There are people who get into political office. Some people say power goes to their heads, and they don't want to give it up. Some people over a period of time, like in some countries very near to us right now in Guyana, believe the country belongs to them, that somehow they have a right to rule over the country. Where they got that notion from, they invent all kind of arguments. So what we are talking about basically is the I word, institutions. Guyana, if it's going to go anywhere, cannot develop without institutions. We cannot work on the basis of the whim, will, and fancy of a few people. And Guyana cannot have a democratic system if political parties are committed to party paramountcy. There are parties, when they are in opposition, they are fighting for free and fair elections. When they get into office, they practice on free and fair elections and they abuse the power. So we have a human problem at the same time. So that's a problem of us as humans. We're not perfect. So that's why we have to develop institutions to restrain us and so forth. Now, the other thing is that in order for us to have a comprehensive policy, we have to start from many angles. The first thing you need is an independent arbiter to overlook, oversee, to supervise the elections. Do we trust ourselves? You know, in the 1985 elections, all the DLM literature, and we've been campaigning since 1982, all the DLM literature was a star. And then the chair of the election commission calls us in and says, look, a couple of days before the election, you have to change your symbol because the United Force, which was collaborating with the dictatorship, says their supporters are going to confuse the star with the sun. I tried to get the list to vote, the documents to fill up and get signatures. And when I went to the election commission, it was barbed wires. They wouldn't allow me in. So you know what we did? We created a document and swore our people in. And then we went on the day to hand the list. And the chief election officer, Paul, I know your family from the quarantine. This is not the right document. I said, of course it's not the right document. You don't allow me to enter the place. He said, okay. I'm going to give you until 7 o'clock tomorrow, not 7, 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. You got to go and get all signatures new again. Can you imagine? No telephone. We're a young movement and we have to go throughout the country now, overnight, and get all these signatures and so forth. It's a lucky thing we had a mass movement with a lot of young people. And they did the impossible. You could not cross the Borbis River without a boat. So we couldn't participate in the elections in all the regions. We had to make a choice because we only had, from 5, 6 o'clock in the afternoon until 9 o'clock next day. So we did it in about 5 regions. So these are the kind of things we have to start with. That all the political parties have a right to access to an election commission that is totally independent. Now, probably the attorney will give us some ideas of how we could put together some criteria on what could really make an election commission independent. Now, when an election commission gets independent and is representative, transparent, and accountable, we have to get a clean voters list. Now, one of the ways the PNC historically had a rigged election was by abusing the voters list. They used to have a national register, and from the national register, they made up a voters list. You have dead people on the list, all kind of people on there. There are people migrating all the time, and so forth. So we have to have a clean list. I remember in 1990, myself, attorney at law Joseph Eliezer, who was vice president of DLM, Claudius London, who was secretary of organization, we went in front of the election commission and burnt the list because 80,000 people were not there. Clive Thomas, who was a presidential candidate, was not on the list. My name was not on the list because we were born in December. That kind of viciousness happened. And then later the PCD went and they also burned the list. So we need first an independent commission, a clean voters list. Now, there are many other things I could talk about. I'll give the attorney because he's been in the most recent election. But there's one thing I want to emphasize. An old Caribbean politician used to tell me, he said, Paul, you don't win an election the night before an election. You don't win an election because you got a lot of people turning out to your meetings and you have mass meetings and so on. So you win the election on the day of election. And you know what that means? In every polling station, you have to have a well-trained polling agent representing your party. Look in Venezuela. That lady did an extraordinary thing. It took her 20 years to have 80,000 volunteers, every polling station, and document what happened. So the truth is that only one political party has that kind of experience and currently the kind of resources financially to train and ensure that polling agents are well trained, they know the laws, the electoral laws, and they are there. So that I think is the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge is how the opposition can maximize their limited resources and get as much resources as possible before the elections, not during the election campaign necessarily alone. You have to begin now to train these polling agents, let them know the electoral, let them be strengthened to stand up. You have to make sure that on the very day that you deposit these people at the polling stations, that you make sure they have lunch and food and this kind of thing. Because if they walk out for half an hour, that could be the difference of the elections. You know, like America, in Chicago, when we have union elections, when somebody is winning the election, the lights go off, and in 15 minutes when the light come back, the other guy is winning the elections. So there's a lot of work that has to be done with polling agents. And I said before, in 1992 elections, I live in South Annandale, went over to North Annandale to vote. DLM did not have a polling agent there. WPA did not have, PNC did not have. And the guy was showing me how to vote for his political party, the only polling agent. So we have to make absolutely sure that the documentation on the day of polling is verified, is signed, and even like what happened in Venezuela recently, that the opposition was able to make copies of the whole documentation so that nobody afterwards, whether it's a party that won or the party that lost, will complain that this election, because we can't be doing that at every election. It's a source of instability, and it's a source of making Guyanese lose confidence in Guyana and themselves that we are not capable of doing this. And we have a big problem in the global south, where a lot of countries are falling down very badly, that they're not capable of organizing transparent, accountable elections. So I would say that we need that those who are going to be involved in the elections politically, that they get together, pool their resources, and separate their competition during the election campaign from ensuring that they put sufficient resources in order to ensure that on the day of election, they really have a verifiable, free and fair election.
I have some questions, but before I do, let's hear from Senior Counsel Timothy Jonas. As you said, the lawyer may offer a different perspective. Tim, Tim, on mute, please.
Well, what you've done is you've betrayed a great deal of knowledge of the electoral process, and you've shown a great deal of personal experience in what has happened. But I think that it's important to focus on the system. As you say, the institution is more important, well, as important as the people implementing it, because the institution has to be transparent. But we also need to remember that this isn't something that is invented as a new thing every 5 years. This is a continuous process. It's a cycle. So the cycle takes place every 5 years. So I hear you when you say, yes, you want the people at the place of poll to be trained and have knowledge. But most of the time, the people at the place of poll were there 5 years before. So when the PNC and the PPP go and start recruiting their soldiers, those soldiers were there 5 years ago, at least 60% of them. So it's not something where you're inventing the wheel. Look, we need to separate two very important aspects of the process. Dr. Tennessee touched on both, but I don't think he segregated them in a way that people need to understand, because if you don't separate the two processes, it's very easy to blur the lines and come up with meaningless cliches like that people voted. And by that little soundbite, obviate what is really an involved and carefully planned out process to prevent dead people voting. So the first aspect of it is the creation of this voters list. And the voters list on the day of election represents the list of Guyanese and others, because Commonwealth citizens who live in here and that kind of thing, but represents the list of individuals who can vote. That's the voters list. Whether they're in Guyana, whether they're out of Guyana, wherever they are, it is the list of people who can vote. Good. How do you get that list? There is a process. When you're born in Guyana, the record of your birth from the hospital goes to the post office, you get your birth certificate, and there is a process that periodically the information of births transfers to the list so that that list is continuously updated. And at the other end, we just talked about people being born, you got people dying. And there is a process, again, a continuous process, where the death is recorded, death certificate is noted, and that record keeping is kept and periodically sent to update the list on a continuous basis. Now, obviously, that system is not foolproof, obviously, because there will be Guyanese who are born out of Guyana. Somebody goes abroad, has a child abroad. So that person will not automatically find their birth certificate in the record going to the list periodically to be updated. A Guyanese might die abroad. So that person is not going to find that the death is recorded in Guyana automatically and goes periodically to the list to be updated. So how is that corrected? With births, it's easy. If Paula Griffith is 18 years old and she was born in America of Guyanese parents, she's Guyanese. And if she wants to vote, there is a claims and objections period that she comes to Guyana, she announces herself, she says, here I am, Paula Griffith, here's my mother's birth certificate, she's Guyanese, I'm Guyanese, put me on the list. And she can be put on the list. That part is easy.
Can I ask a question here, attorney? So that is legally possible that Guyanese living abroad and Guyanese and people of Guyanese parents can go to Guyana and vote in the elections without a residency requirement? Like
there is no residency requirement to vote. If you are Guyanese, you could live in Timbuktu. You're just as Guyanese as the three people talking on this forum.
Legally speaking.
Have the equal right to vote.
Okay.
You may not find a ballot box in Timbuktu. So you'll have to come here where they got ballot boxes. Once you make sure your name is on that list, when you turn up, wherever you turn up, wherever your name appears on that list and where you are registered, you can go and vote. Good. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, it's more difficult, because when someone dies, they can no longer come to say, I'm dead, take me off the list. So that is a bit more carefully managed. And it is where we have had lapses. Now, those lapses don't mean dead people voted. It means that the system of taking the names of deceased persons off the list is not as efficient as it should be. That's what it means. And the reason I say it doesn't mean dead people voted is because even if a dead man's name is on that list, somebody got to turn up with an ID card stick their finger in the ink, put an X, and put it in the paper, put the ballot in the box in front of representatives from PPP and representatives from PNC. So it's two different conversations. I want to separate them. And that's why I object to the cliched nonsense that we've heard from the PNC for bad people voting. Because they take the fact that the list was not foolproof and they jump to that conclusion, ignoring the fact that all of us went to vote on election day and no dead people voted. We all put our finger in the ink and we saw the process, how it worked. Good. So going back to the list, at the end of the day, although I'm satisfied that the 2020 election was done fairly and no dead people voted, we do have to correct our institutions where we see gaps. And there is a gap that it is not as efficient as it should be to take deceased Guyanese off of the electorate list. How do we do it? How do we fix that, narrow that gap? I have proposed before, and I'll propose again, and I'll have to say it 100 more times because no one has even answered from GCOM, from government, or from the main opposition, that in Guyana, there are obligations that each individual has to undergo by law. You got to pay NIS. You got to pay PAYE or income tax. Most people will be applying for a passport every 5 years. Most people will be applying for a driver's license and renewing it. Many people will be buying land or selling land or buying a car or selling a car. All of those processes involve documents and records which prove you are alive.
Mm-hmm.
So when you retire and you go to collect your old age pension and they pay you, that's proof that you're alive. You got to show your life certificate if you don't go personally. So the recommendation I made is that if for a period of 7 years, any person on the list does not do any of these things, doesn't pay PAYE, doesn't pay income tax, doesn't renew a license, doesn't collect pension, anything like that, they come off the list. They are taken off the list if for 7 years there's no transaction done by them, which they are obligated to do under law. That doesn't mean they can't vote. If they've been abroad for the 7 years, all they got to do is come back to Guyana before elections and say, here I am, I'm alive, put me back on the list. But what it does mean is that it means in the space of one election cycle, because elections is 5 years, in the space of one election cycle, if they have not renewed a license, applied for a passport, paid PAYE, paid NIS, collected a pension, they are off. And therefore you narrow that gap and that talk about dead people on the list. It improves the system of removing deceased persons from the list. That's the first thing I wanted to say, and I know I talked a long time, so I want to get to the second issue, which has to do with the conduct of elections on elections day. But I would invite you please to criticize or make another suggestion as to tidying up the system to remove deceased persons from the list.
Yeah, I think, Paul, you have some questions on that?
No, the attorney has made it clear. I wanted to ask Jonas another question. Jonas, so there's no, I know you told me, and I'm being repetitive asking it again. So there's no residency requirement to vote, but
No.
Is there a residency requirement to be a candidate in the elections?
I don't know, Paul. I'm not gonna try to jump in there. To be a candidate, you have to be a Guyanese citizen. And to be president, to be a presidential candidate, I know there is a residency requirement.
There is.
But as for the member of parliament, I don't know the answer to that. I won't pretend I know.
Okay. But the other thing is, you cannot be a Guyanese living abroad, go and vote, become a candidate. Well, it depends. If you could become a candidate, well, then you could be elected to parliament. But you can't hold a ministerial position. Is that correct?
Well, as I said, I know there is that residency requirement for the presidency.
Because the reason why I'm asking you this, Jonas, is a lot of Guyanese abroad are not aware that they could go back home and vote during election time. Some of them may know, but a lot of them don't know.
Well,
So
I
that
can
brings
assure
us
you.
to another thing. We really need to educate the people at home and abroad of what changes have occurred since 1992 in the electoral laws, the election systems, and so forth.
I
They,
can assure you that I
The court,
myself know dozens of Guyanese who fly home to vote.
oh,
Dozens of Guyanese. Personally, I know them.
I wasn't aware.
the
I
court,
thought they were cheating when they did that.
the court has made it clear that your name cannot be removed from the list unless you're dead or something like that.
Okay.
And secondly, once your name is on the list, regardless of where you live, you have the right to vote, but you have to vote in the border of Guyana.
But what the attorney is saying is that if your name is not on the list, you're alive and living abroad, you could enter Guyana and within the context of when they're preparing the list,
Right,
yes,
right,
to
correct.
say, look, objection, my name is not on the list.
Yes.
I think we got to separate, and I know academics blur this line a lot. The hypothetical situation, the rule, from the practical implementation of the rule. The rule is if you're Guyanese, you can vote. So that deals with any question, whether you're living on the moon, whether you're living in Mars. If you're
But
Guyanese,
name
you
have to
are
be on the
entitled to
list,
vote.
or
I'm
you
sorry?
have to be on the vote.
Good. Now you have just gone to the practicality of how to make that happen.
Okay.
So how practically do you administer a system to enable Guyanese to vote? The rule is you're Guyanese, you can vote. So you got to make sure there's a list of Guyanese so that strangers not coming and odd people not coming because somebody got to administer this thing. You got to set up places where these Guyanese can come to vote, come to carry out their franchise. Those are practical considerations where you do the best you can to apply the rule. And the rule is if you're Guyanese, you can vote. This is why we run into problems about updating the list and newborn or youngsters who now become 18, getting them onto the list, getting rid of dead people off of the list. Those are practical considerations. But the rule is, you Guyanese, you can vote.
Vishnu, did you go home and vote during any of these elections?
No.
Okay. Do you know of anybody who did?
A lot of people I know,
Do you know if their names were on the list,
correct.
on the voters list, and if it was not there, how did they get their name onto it?
No, but your names were not supposed to be removed from the list. Once it's on the list, it's not supposed to be removed. And I think the last time there was a house-to-house registration was in around 1997 or thereabout, or 2000.
Now, to go back to the question you asked about voting abroad, that again goes to the practicality of whether the administration is going to facilitate people, Guyanese who are abroad, to enable them to vote. In Barnum's time, Barnum very graciously and accommodatingly allowed people overseas to vote.
Yeah,
And I have a good friend who tells me that in Venezuela, in Caracas, a box was put up solemnly in the Guyana embassy at Caracas, and not a single person turned up to vote. And an army officer solemnly turned up to collect the box and bring it back home to Guyana. And it was declared that 1,500 people voted for the PNC.
And my friend Rudy Collins, who did a very good job as chair of election commission, was the ambassador at that time because I was teaching in Venezuela exactly at that time.
Did you vote? Did you vote, Paul?
Of course not.
So the point I'm making is that when a ball starts rolling down the hill, it keeps rolling on its own momentum. And that's why when Hoyt turned up and took the lead in 1985, I suspect the momentum from the previous 20 years was already in train. So that was a foregone conclusion.
Abolish overseas voting.
Now in 1992, that was one of the concessions made to get rid of that enormous administrative gap which allowed the most vulgar kind of rigging to go on. So many people from London and the islands voted for the PNC in 1985. That stopped. So one of the issues that arose, and this is why the question is asked, well, why is it that why is it doubt that Guyanese who are abroad can vote? What happened is that it was agreed that the administration would not accommodate in London and Toronto and abroad ballot boxes and safeguard them and pretend to bring them back for counting, because that was a source of corruption at the time. So it was done away with. If you're abroad and you want to vote, come back to vote. There's no ballot boxes made available abroad. That's the only difference, an administrative, practical difference.
Any other questions, Paul?
No, I want to get back to the idea of polling agents, though. I don't.
Well, Paul, before you do, can we finish the question of sanitizing the list by removing the names of any Guyanese on the list who has not filed any of these returns or made any of these records for a period of 7 years? Do you see any difficulty with that? Or do you think it can work and can really narrow that gap?
Well, what I think would be required there is that you have to have staff to do cross-checking and having access to those records so they could check the list versus, the owners of passport, NIS payment, and so forth. That would require some work. That is why I'm saying that preparing for the elections is that it takes time and it has to be done. So, Attorney, I want to ask you a question because you are one of the leaders of a party that has a seat in Parliament and you participated in the last election. Where are we right now with the state of, let's say, an independent election commission and a voters list? Let's start with those two. Where do we stand right now, in your opinion, as Anud? What is the situation right now?
Well, 1 year before the next election cycle, I think we got to live with what we have. Now, I think that the GCOM demonstrated very well at the last election that the system, the institution, was strong enough to withstand the attempts to undermine things by corrupt individuals. The system allowed that corruption to be exposed very quickly and very publicly so that it was visible to everybody and could be dealt with. You can't save the world and stop theft. You can't convert everybody to religion and make us all angels. There will always be crooks. And therefore, the purpose of an institution is to safeguard against that thievery. Not to convert the heathen, but to safeguard against the heathen. And what we saw in 2020 was that the system that existed safeguarded by raising the alarm immediately when thievery took place. So I'm satisfied with it. It's very political. You got 3 PPPites there, 3 PNCites there. And then you got the chairman. No one has faith in any of those people. And yet, because they are looking at each other with very sharp eyes, nobody trusted anybody, the thing worked. Because as soon as one side schemed, the other side cried murder. We got to keep that as is. Insofar as the list is concerned, the suggestions I made, in all likelihood, cannot be implemented by next year. But as I said before, the fact that there are gaps in the system so that the process of removing deceased persons is not foolproof does not mean that those deceased persons voted, because the process of voting on voting day is practically foolproof. It is very good. And this is what I want to talk about. On the day of voting, you have slightly over 2,000 places of poll throughout the country, so not a huge amount. At each place of poll, all parties are entitled to have a representative, and for the most part, with very few exceptions, the PPP and the PNC will both have representatives there. So again, they're looking at each other like hawks. Because it's 2,200 places of poll, that is decentralized enough that even if you can undermine and corrupt 1 or 10 of them, it's unlikely that is going to change the overall result of the election. You got to undermine 500 or 1,000 of them to really have a meaningful impact. So you have 22,000 autonomous units where people are lining up to go to vote, where they're supposed to vote. And at that place, they have to show their ID card. Their ID is compared to their face and then compared to the list to make sure they're there. They stick their finger in ink. They're given a ballot. They sign where they want to sign on the ballot. They put their X and they put it in the box. All of that is done under the scrutiny of at least a PPP representative and a PNC representative, along with the other GCOM officers in that place of poll. At the end of the day, the same people who are there, the representatives and the officers in the place of poll, close the doors and count the ballots. And they write down the result. It might only be 900 votes taken in that place of poll, 600 votes taken in that place of poll. It might only be a couple, but they write it down, they sign the statement of poll, and they post it up outside on the door. It is very difficult to undermine that process, where you have over 2,000 autonomous, independent places of poll doing the same thing. The change I would strongly urge, which does not need legislation, it just needs an agreement in GCOM by the 3 and the chairman of the GCOM Elections Commission, is that that statement of poll, which was the center of our problems in 2000 when one side made them disappear.
Exactly.
Don't just put it on the door where only a couple people from the village can come to see it and anybody can tear it down. Take a picture of the thing and put it up on a website which is available to everybody in the country.
Attorney, I want to just pin a point. That's exactly the issue right now in Venezuela. Exactly what you just said. Because what the opposition did, they got those statements of poll, and before any intervention could have been done by the ruling party, they put it up on the website. And until today, the ruling party has not done similar of showing the results of the election.
Well, what happens then, you see? What happens then is that before GCOM even declares the result, the whole country knows the result.
Exactly.
Because Starbrook News, Kaicher News, Chronicle, Times, everybody, exactly, you and me, will be watching and counting and adding it up as these things are put on the website. But I want
to go back to another point. I would really like to see the statistics of whether the PNC has as many polling agents as the PPP does. The PPP always, even though I must say they have been unique, the only Marxist-Leninist party in the entire history of Marxism-Leninism and political parties that have always had the best electoral system. They have always spent resources on the electoral system. I doubt whether in predominantly Indo-Guyanese area that the PNC have placed polling agents. I'd like to see the statistics.
I also have another question related to that. I'm a small party. I don't have resources. I can't have polling agents, maybe in even
2,000. He mentioned it. It's 2,000 we have to have.
Yeah, but I will not. I can't afford polling agents anyway.
That's my point.
Resources.
Anu, Anu put 2,000 people there? You have to depend on the PNC as opposition and
right,
the PPP as government. So that the two of them, as you said, would be looking at each other. But where does that leave you?
Okay. Now, if you go forward to putting the statements of poll up on the website, you solve that problem of hidden statements of poll. But to answer your question, what happened the last time around, and the answer for small parties, is that even if you can only get 50, you can only get 50 representatives to go and take a picture of that statement of poll. You stay quiet with your 50, because when the count then happens, nobody knows what 50 you have, hopefully. And when you see you got the one in Victoria, place a poll in Victoria, that's one of the 50 you got, and it comes up to be counted, and the returning officer declares Victoria, PNC 909, PPP 1, and it accords with the one you have, then you have to concede generally this thing was fair. Hopefully that returning officer doesn't know you got Victoria. He might think you got Buxton or Lusignan. So you have to keep quiet what you have. But if you only got 50 and the 50 that you have correspond when they are called, you got to acknowledge that generally the thing was fair. That's the best you can do. But you resolve that problem because in each of those places of poll, when the PPP looking at the PNC and the PNC looking at the PPP, they do it fair, you know.
But this is the point I'm trying to make, that the PNC never had experience in electoral politics. The only time they had experience was in the post-92. And that is because they're always depending on stealing the election.
I'm sorry, I don't agree with you. I don't agree with you at all.
Yes, I know. I give you an example in 92. We didn't have polling, WPA didn't have, and PNC did not have a polling agent in Annandale.
Dr. Tennessee, the fact that they didn't have a polling agent doesn't mean they're not experienced. If
No,
they
but
are
they
going to
don't have-
undermine,
they
hear
don't
me
have
please, hear me.
somebody-
If they are going to undermine an
Your
election,
argument
Paul, let's hear him.
yeah,
if
your
you
argument
are,
so is that
Paul, let me finish. Please let me finish.
And a PPP polling agent, they'll be looking at each other and we'll get the right outcome. Is that correct?
If you are going to undermine an election system, you have to know that system inside out.
Exactly. Okay.
So the very fact that you are saying that the PNC undermined the process in 1985 means that the PNC knew that process so well that they knew what to do to undermine it.
Well, all they had to do is send the military and seize the ballot boxes. That wasn't very.
No, because somebody had to stuff them, somebody had to count them, somebody had to be present to sign them off. So they knew the system. And in 1992, and in 2005, and in 2011, and in 2015, and in 2020, we have had elections. It is a cycle. It's not inventing the wheel each time around.
I still think that the opposition has to pool resources and do a lot of work at these various areas so that we don't have complaints at the end, you know.
Now, to answer your question, if the PNC find that they're 2 or 3 short, they got to choose a place that they won't have a representative. I can guarantee you that the place they will choose is a place like Annandale, because that's a place they'll get 2 votes anyway. So that the loss there is minor. You can't stuff ballot boxes in an area that voting for the other side anyway. And if the PPP have to choose a place they won't have a representative, they'll choose somewhere like Buxton or Victoria because they're not getting Beirut. They're not getting votes there anyway. So the amount that they would lose by not being present is minimal, is minuscule. But that doesn't happen. In 2020, there was representation and everybody was looking at everybody else. And the last item that I want us to bear in mind, because it is so critical for us, because we can't look after our own house, is we have to have foreign observers here scrutinizing the system, scrutinizing the process, present before elections and present on elections day, to see that everything is going smoothly and to give it a clean bill of health. And that nonsense that happened in 2020, where you said the card center can't come to watch the recount because of COVID and that kind of foolishness, that is an indication of, what was the word they were using the other day, not authoritarianism. It is an indication of an autocratic government.
Autocracy.
Because the more people that come, the more transparent it is. And once there's an accredited observer, you invite them, you bring them.
I agree with you 100%. And the paper I wrote that was published, that's exactly what it's entitled, Guyana 2020 Election, Regime Change - foreign intervention. Because the argument of the opposition, which I documented, well, not the opposition, the then government, the incumbent of the PNC and AFC was, and WPA, was that it was foreign intervention that facilitated the PPP to get into political office. You're correct on that, but I agree with you. We need international observers. We need international observers. It helps democracy. It tells the world that Guyana is a liberal, democratic country, and that's
the tragedy is as well. The tragedy is that we so easily look at what was a vulgar attempt, and then we forget that in 2015, when the PPP lost a fair election, they cried fraud, and we forget Gokul Budu and the seat from Linden. And we forget that these things cut two ways. The system has to be there not to safeguard only against one, because I promise you, neither side has wings and halos. We are dealing with people who are rotten to the core on both sides, unfortunately.
So, Paul, any other final points before we close up?
No, well, all I'm saying is that all those points that have been made by attorney are very valid, but I'd like to see a comprehensive documentation on how we policy and practices on the elections in Guyana for 2025, because I think we should try and avoid another, as I say, hocus pocus over the elections. It's not good for Guyana, it's not good for Guyanese, it's not good for the country. That's my view.
That we should have a comprehensive policy plan.
Yeah, and we need to educate both the Guyanese at home and abroad on the election system in Guyana, how it works, as an attorney eloquently explained some very important points about the election.
Senior counsel, any final comments, points?
I think it's an important subject. Unfortunately, it's not one that involves a shouting match, unless you use empty cliches like that people voted. But at the end of the day, if you are going to be administratively sound and represent an institution that is administratively competent and does its job fairly and justly, you have to look at that boring, ordinary, nitty-gritty ins and outs. You have to look at those details and get them right. I think that the system we have is good, but it can be tweaked, and I would like to see those changes. I would like to see a system that more efficiently removes deceased people, and I would like to see a system that posts the SOPs up on a website immediately they are finalized on the day of election.
Before you go, Bishop, can I ask Council a question?
Please.
It's more political. How does Anouk see the 2025 elections? You guys, are you all going to participate, go independent, or are you going to coalesce, or have you started your campaign?
I can't speak for Anouk. I'm not authorized to do that here. I'm speaking here as Timothy Jonas. But I'm very certain that Anouk will be there next year.
Wonderful.
Because I have not seen on the horizon any meaningful hope besides Anouk in terms of a third party for those people who have rejected APNU and PPP.
And when you say APNU, you include the AFC, I assume.
Until I am convinced otherwise, I'm afraid at this stage, yes.
Okay.
I have a question or a comment. Would it be wise to give consideration of paying those who are recruited as polling agents for the state to compensate their time for that particular day or days? Wouldn't this provide for greater watchful eyes on the elections?
I would say that 100%. I think it makes sense. If you're really committed to democracy, it's a good investment. For all political parties contesting in the election, you should provide a fund to pay the polling agents for that day. We have a lot of money now, and we could use the money now to invest in democracy. That's a good idea, Fish. That's a good idea you came up with. You should advocate it more.
You know, we talk about policies as if they're fairy tales. Right now, we have a regime that is handing out white envelopes to Guyanese filled with money because we care. They're going into Amerindian communities and handing out gifts. They're going to farmers. They're going to fishermen. They're handing out money. They're awarding contracts to the friendly faces all over the place. We are already seeing an election campaign taking place by a party that is flush with money, with no accountability, with no accounting, auditing responsibility. We're seeing it already. So how do you persuade that group to pass legislation or to implement a policy that lends help to the terrible opposition? They're already monopolizing the state-owned media, the papers, the radios, the TV, state-owned, and spouting the government message. They're already flooding social media, using state funds to do all of this. They already have trolls cussing down any opposition on social media. It's nice to talk about a fairy tale, man. Let's be fair and let's give everybody an equal shake and money all around and all of that. It'll never happen. So let's accept the reality and try to understand what the rules of the game are. And the rules of the game are, they got the money, we don't. They got the personnel, we don't. But Guyanese aren't happy. And
So
Guyanese
does
aren't
that mean that Anug will not be able to make a difference because the election would be bought?
I don't think I said the elections would be bought. I hope that's not what you
That's an implication, but
Gentlemen,
because
that's the final word.
or you think people will take the white envelope and still go and vote for Anug?
That's what they've done so far.
Okay.
So in Rumvelt, they've taken their new roads and new drains that have been built, although the main city council should have had the money to do it. Elsewhere, they're taking their gifts and smiling, but they're not changing their, in Linden, they took their gifts. They're not changing their vote. The last local government elections demonstrated that.
Interesting.
All right, gentlemen, let that be the final word. We'll meet again soon, I hope. Thank
It
you.
was a pleasure, gentlemen. Take care.
Good to see you,
See you
Diana.
soon. Thank you, sir.
Thanks. Bye.